Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on Australia's threatened plants, a new threatened plant index, and how we can save and recover Australia's precious threatened plant species. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm here to facilitate today, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today and joining this webinar today. I'm here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'm privileged to live and work in Canberra and the surrounding regions, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of this country. I'd also like to acknowledge country all around Australia from where all of our speakers and panelists and all of you are joining us today. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the importance of giving priority to Indigenous custodianship of country as we talk about our rare and precious species in Australia. We're all incredibly mindful of the unique heritage of this continent and its islands, and of the care for that heritage that has been shown for eons by the traditional owners and since time immemorial, and the damage that has been done since colonisation. I'd particularly like to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Indigenous people who are joining us here today. While I'm here, I'll also introduce my silent facilitator, Aisha Tulloch. She will be in the background, popping links and information in the chat and helping facilitate today. And to you, our audience, I'd now like to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat by typing in where you're from, your organisation, and also the Indigenous land from which you are joining us today. Please introduce yourselves and let us know that who is out there in our audience. We'll keep our chat open for a short while you have the opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat. Welcome everybody. While we do that, I will just introduce this webinar series. This is the final for 2020's webinar series from the Nest Threatened Species Recovery Hub. We've hosted a series of webinars throughout the year, and you can find many of those webinars on our website under the events menu. We have put up recordings of previous webinars and information and resources on all the webinars we've held this year to date, and we'll also be holding webinars. We intend to hold webinars into next year, so please keep your eye on that website that will be popped up in the chat after you've all introduced yourselves. So I see we have people from around the continent, from Bundjalung country, from Yurragandi country in Cairns, from Yamachi country, from Yugara and Turrbal country, Larrakia, so many parts of the continent, from Wurundjeri country. Thanks so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. We'll leave that chat open for a while. While we do so, I'll explain a little bit about how the webinar is going to run. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers. Just before that, I'll let you know about the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask a question at any point throughout the webinar, you will be able to do so using that Q&A panel. So that is right next to the chat button on most people's at the bottom of the screen on most people's screens, and please feel free to ask any questions throughout. We'll also be inviting you to upvote any questions that other people put. We've got many people joining us today, and we won't be able to necessarily get to all of your questions. We will provide a resources pack afterwards, so hopefully that will help address some detail and follow-up questions that you may have. But please upvote each other's questions to make sure that the most popular and most important questions are addressed in our webinar live today. So today we're going to hear a little on a world first threatened plant index, why it exists, what it does, its uses, and we're going to discuss just how our threatened plants are faring across Australia. The index is the brainchild of our first speaker from the University of Queensland. Many of you will know Professor Hugh Possingham. He's a highly accomplished global leader in conservation research and decision science. He's a professor at the University of Queensland, and he is now also Queensland's chief scientist. Today, Hugh is going to be sharing with us the grand vision of the Threatened Species Index project. So welcome, Hugh, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. People don't expect too much from a grand vision, but I'll do my best. It's certainly really exciting to be launching the Threatened Plant Index. I mean, in some senses, plants are the Cinderella group of threatened species. As I often say, when somebody thinks of a threatened species, they immediately see a black cockatoo or a numbat. But in fact, the fact, and Misha will show you in a second, the majority of our threatened species are plants on the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. There's 10 times as many threatened plants as there are birds, and 10 times as many threatened plants as there are mammals. And so it's going to be exciting, and I'll let Misha unveil the trends and show you what's really happening. Also, in fact, we've updated the mammal and bird indices. So once you get into the app, you can have a see how they've gone over the last year. But let me tell to Rachel's point a bit about where this index came from and why are we doing this? Why are we assembling all this data? I mean, what is even the point of monitoring? I often ask that myself. So it was actually about 6 years ago at the beginning of the National Environmental Science Program Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and Judy West, who's there on screen, was there at that first board meeting. And we proposed that we should actually track threatened species and assemble as much data from across the nature as we could for all of our threatened species. And why? What's the point of that? Well, I mean, the first point is we'd just been funded to run a hub on the nation's threatened species. Various states had invested more in threatened species. For example, the New South Wales government on their SAOS programs. Different state governments have quite impressive and extensive investments in threatened species. And the federal government had just identified 70 threatened species, which were going to be priority threatened species, of which 30 are plants. So with all that money, you really want to actually track what's going on to invest and manage and not try and work out whether you're succeeding. Sort of seems a little bit like insanity. So in some senses, to me, it was a no-brainer. A lot of people didn't particularly like the idea. I don't think they thought it was a bad idea. I think they actually generally thought it was sort of going to be impossible. And I'll get back to that in a second. But the other thing, I suppose, is people just need to know. I mean, Australians want to know how their threatened species are going. And despite a lot of efforts over the years, it was very hard to get a national picture of all these three major groups. And of course, I'm sorry about the insect and the moss and the fungi people. Your time will eventually come. People often say, how are things going? And in fact, the Threatened Species Index has already been instrumental in forming the EPBC Act review. Graham Samuels was shown the Threatened Species Index. And then anybody asking the question, actually, maybe things really aren't so bad, are they? No, nothing to see here. As soon as they see the index and they look at the website, you'll see that things are very bad. So message number one, there's no doubt about it. Australia's threatened species are in a very poor state. We don't have to argue about that anymore, but hopefully our investments will improve that state. But why did people say it was impossible? Because it's a big country and there's a lot of threatened species. And so what do you do when something's impossible? What do you do when nobody thinks it's going to work? You get a whole heap of postdocs that are enthusiastic and seem to be able to work 100 hours a week, like Misha and Aisha and Elisa, Diego and Felipe, and then you get them to corral hundreds and hundreds of people to give you their data. And we're very grateful for all the efforts that everybody, many who are on this call, have put into assembling the data for us. So it wasn't for the passion and drive of those individuals and the slavish signing of data sharing agreements, which is extremely painful. We would never have this threatened species index. So to be honest, I was 50-50 that this would all work. And I think it's only worked because of the hard work of those researchers. And so what I really want to leave you with is 4 key points, I suppose. Why has it been so hard? And I'd say one thing, Australians ecologists are good at space and we're rubbish at time. So we lead the world in species distribution modelling. We have Atlas of Living Australia. Henry Nix in the 1970s was building the first species distribution models. We had Bioclim and Annuclim, amazing things. And now people like Jane Elis are world leaders in that field. States have very good spatial data. But I don't know whether it's because the country's ridiculously big or Europeans haven't been here for very long and we don't have a decent sense of history. We have been very, very poor at tracking change through time. If you can't track change through time, you'll have never idea of whether any management you are doing is working. The second point of my 4 that I want to say is South Australia is really amazing because they provided about half the data. So it's not as though you have to be in the most biodiverse state or the state with the most threatened species. It's really, are you organised? Do you have people committed to collecting that data? And we know a lot of threatened plant data is still out there, so we encourage you to send it in because this is a living index and it can be completely updated every year. Third point, penultimate point, I mean, you knew it, Australia's biodiversity is going down the toilet. I said that 41 years ago. David Attenborough said it last night, so it was new information. It's not new information. It's not going well. Maybe it's some of our efforts are starting to show rewards, so I'm encouraged, but we still have a lot of work to do. And so what is the message from this? I suppose it's go out and count some more plants. It's not that hard. It's definitely not as hard as mammals, and it's probably not as hard as birds. I've actually done threatened plant counts in the past on various orchids, and I've cleverly lost all my data in a spreadsheet that I can't find. So what's my New Year's resolution? My New Year's resolution is it should be drink less alcohol, do some exercise, but it's actually going to be, I will next year start counting 3 threatened plants in Southeast Queensland so I can contribute, not next year, but the year after when I have 2 points, and 2 points is the start of a time series to the threatened plant index. So I encourage you all to do the same and encourage all your friends and local community groups. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Hugh, for that great introduction. So our second speaker is Dr. Misha Jackson, who earlier this year took the reins as the driving force behind the Threatened Species Index project. She is passionate about improving environmental outcomes through evidence-based research, and she's here to talk to us today about the findings from the latest index, the Threatened Plant Index, and the challenges that our plants are experiencing. So over to you, Misha.
Thanks very much, and thanks so much to everyone for joining us this afternoon. For those of you I don't know, my name is Misha Jackson, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the wonderful Australian Threatened Species Index team at the University of Queensland. Joining you from Larrakia country, acknowledge elders past and present, existing and emerging leaders, as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined the webinar today. As Hugh mentioned, and I'm sure all of you are very well aware, Australia has many threatened species, and a disproportionate number of those are plants. So more than 1,300 of our 1,800 still living threatened species are plants. And of course, people all around Australia are engaging in monitoring of our hundreds of threatened species. So state government monitoring programs, universities, researchers, Indigenous land and sea management organisations, community groups, NGOs, citizen scientists, all of these people are engaging in monitoring efforts around the country. But as Hugh mentioned, until recently, it was difficult to think about how we could bring this monitoring effort all together and look at some of these big picture questions that Hugh mentioned. And that's very much the challenge that this project decided to tackle. So the index compiles all available monitoring data to tell us how our threatened species are doing overall. And this also allows us to ask things like which groups are doing better or worse and which ones are most in need of attention. As you can imagine, to embark on such an effort, you need lots and lots of collaborative effort. So the index research was led by a team at the University of Queensland, but the project engaged early on with BirdLife Australia as a key partner. Of course, we're supported by the Australian Government's National Environmental Science Program, the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, all of the state and territory governments, as well as 30 other conservation and research organisations, and more than 200 individual friends of the index. So how did we set about doing this? Well, the project looked to the Living Planet Index for an approach for making a threatened species index in Australia. The Living Planet Index was designed by WWF and the Zoological Society of London, and it tracks global vertebrates through time and then uses this trend to report on things like targets in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this first came out in 1998. It's been coming out every 2 years since, and the last index published very recently showed an average decline of 68% between 1970 and 2016 of global vertebrates. So you may ask, if we have a Living Planet Index, why did we need an Australian Threatened Species Index? The reason is that the LPI draws on published data in order to produce the index. And as it turns out, a lot of the monitoring data in Australia is not in the published scientific literature. And so Australia was very poorly represented in the LPI. And so that's a key reason why this project endeavoured to bring together as much monitoring effort as possible from around Australia, not just from the public literature, but from all these different places and organisations. You may have seen in previous years that we have tackled birds and mammals in the past through the Threatened Species Index, and we've just released the pilot for the Threatened Plant Index, as well as an update for the mammals and the birds. So, drum roll, what did we find? Well, you're looking here at the main Australian Threatened Plant Index for the whole country. What you're looking at is you can see there's a reference year. So the first year of the index in this case is 1995, and that's always going to be set to 1. And what we're looking at is the relative change in comparison to what was going on during this base year. So we're not concerned at all with the population numbers themselves. We're looking at relative change over time. And that's one of the things that allows us to combine monitoring data from all different types of approaches and methods. So what we found is that between 1995 and 2017, we had an average decline of more than 70% across 112 different plant species or subspecies. And this comprised 611 time series. So a time series is somewhere where the same species was monitored in exactly the same place using the same method in multiple years. That's sort of the minimum criteria for being able to include data in the index. We also have some diagnostic tools. So on the upper left, you see that trend again. In the upper right, you can see where the data came from. So in the case of the plants, it's obvious from this map that most of the data are from South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and Western Australia. So we'd certainly like to fill that map in future. In the lower left, you can see each of those lines as a time series. You can see we've accumulated more of those as we move forward through the years. And in the lower right, you can see the number of taxa in black and time series in blue and how those have changed over time. You can see that's dramatically increased since about 1990. In the index, when you visit our website, you can also drill down into regional trends. I don't have time to talk about each of the state trends now, but I wanted to show them to you and encourage you to have a look at those. Each state also has its own fact sheet, which is available on our website. And I will say that in particular for the plant index, we received a lot of monitoring data and cooperation from state government partners in particular for the data in the plant index. So encourage you to explore those trends for yourself. I'll flash up the website later. Another way you can drill down into the index is to look at functional groups. So one of the groups of plants we received quite a bit of data on were orchids. And if you look at this composite trend for orchids, which comes from 31 taxa across 152 time series, you can see that the average change, so the end point, is around the same as the overall index, a decline of about 70%. But there's a lot more variability in this trend. You can probably see a gray cloud around the trend. That's a confidence limit. So it's generated by randomly generating 100 trends, dropping the 5 furthest from the average, and you sort of get this 95% confidence limit. And you can see that that's very wide for the orchids. So that means that there's more variability in these trends than in some of the other groups. We can also look at the index by management. So these are the results for those populations where custodians indicated they were being managed. So herbivore control, pest or disease control, translocations. And the average change across these populations from 1995 to 2017 was a decline of about 60%. So not quite as bad as the overall average. And that's across 64 taxa and 261 time series. If we look at just those populations that were translocated or included translocated individuals, that's 11 taxa and 43 time series, we see an average decrease of about 45%. So an additional sort of improvement on that average. On the other hand, if we look at those species for which we don't know about any management taking place, and that applies to 74 taxa across 350 time series, we saw an average decrease of about 80%. So this is sending a signal that there is an influence or a relationship between the trend of plant species and whether or not that they have received management and conservation attention. So there's many more things you can look at with the index that I don't have time to go into now. So I encourage you to hop on our website. You can look at all different groups there. You can set different reference years. You can look at the birds, the mammals, and the plants. And you can also download some of the summaries and information that go into making the index. So I'd like to thank all of the many people who contributed data to the index. You can go online and see the citations for all of the people who contributed. These efforts going on across the country are, of course, very admirable, and they're going to be the things that help us to recover our threatened species, and that's something that we hope to be able to track over time through the Threatened Species Index. So thank you very much, and thank you also to the wonderful Threatened Species Index team. This has been a real delight to work on this project this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha, and thank you to everyone who has contributed to the index. It's an enormous joint effort of a project, so we really appreciate it. Just a reminder to continue to contribute your questions in the using the Q&A button down the bottom if you haven't found it already, and please continue to upvote the questions that are the most important that you would most like to hear answered today. So I'm now going to introduce our third speaker, Tony Ault. Tony is currently president of the Australian Network for Plant Conservation. Prior to this, he has had 30 years of experience working in conservation research, management and policy, including with the New South Wales government. He's got a deep understanding of the threats facing many of our threatened plants and ecological communities and their habitats and extinction risks. And he'll be speaking to us now on some of the key challenges faced by our threatened plants and the importance of focusing on threatened plant conservation. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today and pay my respect to elders past and present just before I begin. I just want to take a really quick overview of conservation of Australian plants, look at the role and the sort of information the index is telling us, and sort of ask the questions about, two questions really I want to look at. Why are plants declining at such a high rate? What sort of things is driving that? And what can we do about that in terms of actions to remediate those declines? And measuring decline, as Hugh and Micah have said, is a really critical thing, and I really want to support the index for doing this. We don't have much decline data on plants over time, but it's a key element. We have a number of things we know threaten plants. In the left-hand side of that screen there, you can see one of my favorites, or my problems I've been dealing with, is regeneration failure. So ecosystem processes that are disrupted, but there's lots of other things that go on as well. But it's really great to see measuring decline in the index. One of the interesting things is for plants, they're a bit different than other vertebrates or the vertebrates themselves. If you look at how plants are listed as threatened, most of the time now we're using IUCN Red List criteria. And most plants, you can see on this graph, Australia is the white bars and the globe, the world, is the grey bars. But basically this is just plants. And most plants, be it in Australia or around the world, are essentially listed under IUCN Red List Criterion B. What that means is that these plants have restricted distributions. They're essentially narrow range endemics, but at the same time, there are other factors that allow them to be listed, and usually that is they're in decline. So just think of that group as narrow range endemics that are declining. That's a feature of plants more so than vertebrates. There are other plants, particularly in Australia, that are listed under Criterion C, which got very small populations and decline, or Criterion D, which are just extremely low populations. We don't have many plants where we have relay, which is decline rates relative to the globe or relative to vertebrates. So it'd be really nice. The index is going to help us improve this kind of listing process here and understanding of this group. But the thing about having a lot of narrow range endemics and decline for those things is it makes them very susceptible to habitat loss. And that very susceptibility occurs at very small scales. So even losses of very small areas of habitat can be a problem for plants. On the ground, many plants don't occupy a very big space. If you look, have been involved with clearing regulation, you'll see that often there's a threshold. And if you're below that threshold, it might be 2 hectares, it might be 5 hectares, it might be 10 hectares. It's usually considered there's no environmental impact. Well, I would argue that for plants, there is no threshold because even very small scale habitat loss can be significant for those plants. And that's one of the things I think that's driving this high rate of decline in plants. Along with this, we have the other major threats to plants that are occurring around the country, be it feral grazers, weeds, pathogens, global warming, which is making fire regimes become adverse to plant species and persistence. The other sort of thing that I'll throw out there is that for too long, plant conservation has been the poor cousin of vertebrate conservation. Hugh touched on this a little bit in his talk. And so given that plants are key components of the structure and habitat for many animals, it's kind of strange that they receive so little attention and little resourcing. But I think it's also another thing that explains why plants are in a worse state than other vertebrates. As I've mentioned, I don't think our current legislative regulations provide sufficient protection. And Micah gave a really good example of that in her talk. She showed that where plants have some management going on, they're doing better where there's no management going on. Okay? They're still in decline under management, so the legislative regulations aren't sufficient yet to stop that decline, but there's a difference there. And on top of all this, we kind of face a changing world with climate change. And some work that's just recently emerged from last season's bushfires is by Rachel Gallagher here, looking at a whole lot of plant taxa, both threatened and non-threatened, that are currently considered to be at risk of decline based on the impact of those fires. So I think the index is going to be very useful in the future to capture these things and to see what happens in relation to those extreme sort of events. So what are we going to do? What can we do? We're kind of missing a few pieces in the puzzle for plants. One is we don't have a full list of what's at risk. We have a list of what's on the EPBC Act that's threatened, but that's probably about a quarter of the plants being assessed. So if you look at this kind of little diagram I have on the side, the dark circle in there is 1,000 or so plants on the EPBC Act. The sort of darker grey is how many we think we've assessed. The lighter grey represents all the endemic plants that haven't been assessed, all the work we have yet to do. What's going to happen over time as we do that work, this black circle is going to increase until it's bigger than that dark grey circle. So there's lots more things that require listing at the moment. Why is that important? Well, these things are just being lost without any attention. Without being listed, we can't actually protect them for conservation measures. We don't protect them under regulation. So it's really important to get that right. We're a long way behind the vertebrates in terms of the listing process for plants. I've also already mentioned about resourcing. The other thing I want to mention is we need to be a bit smarter and a bit more broad scale in how we deal with the threats to plants, along with the threats to animals. We're starting to do that now with animals. We've seen a lot of initiatives in relation to cat predation and how to reduce it. We need to think in the same light for our plants. The big issue we kind of fail to deal with is clearing. We don't say no more loss. Even for critically endangered species, we're allowing further loss, and it's simply unsustainable. We're going to have a lot more extinctions unless we can address that. We need to deal with biosecurity for all the introduced species. That's one of the major issues that's coming out of climate changes. And the impact of myrtle rust on a lot of plants and their rapid decline is a good example of that. For some of our other threats, I think we have some mechanisms that we can take further broadly and apply across the country. In terms of fire, We have enough science to work out what the fire tolerance thresholds are for plants. We just need to apply that across the nation. In New South Wales, as an example, we have that operating at the moment as a guide for fire frequency, but we need to do it for other components of the fire regime. We need to do it right across the nation. Sorry. Oops. And lastly, we need to manage the other side of the coin. Outside the wild, we need to have our backups. We need to ensure we've got adequate ex situ conservation, comprehensive seed banks, or other backups of genetic material. We need to work out best practice ecological restoration and translocation. We've got some really good documents to support that. ANPC have done an update for their translocation guidelines in 2018, currently working on an update to the plant germplasm guidelines, which will come out next year. So our material for best practice management exists for ex situ. We perhaps don't have the same level of material for in situ management yet. My last point I want to make is really we need better integration of management of both plants and animals from an ecosystem perspective. And I'll give one sort of example here, I'll touch on an example. We're doing a lot of work with cats, we're doing a lot of exclusion around the country, we're putting mammals that have gone locally extinct back in, and we're assuming that's wonderful for everything. And I would ask the question, is it? How does it affect the plants and the communities that exist in that place? We need to do these things in a holistic sort of manner and work out what's best for everything, where are the trade-offs, and be very, very cautious of thinking one size fits all. So in summary, there's lots of work to be done. I think we have enough sound science to make a big difference. The Threatened Species Index, I think, is going to be great to help track success and progress. What we need is kind of, in a sense, more resourcing, more commitments, both political and social, to actually conserving plant species. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony, for that overview. I'd now like to move to introducing each of our panelists in turn, and I'm going to start with our first panelist, Judy West. So Judy is the Executive Director of the Australian National Botanic Gardens in the Australian Government. Judy's scientific expertise is in plant systematics and phylogenetics and in conservation biology. So Judy, could you please give us some insights into your, from your research expertise and also your perspective from the Botanic Gardens into some of the key challenges facing Australia in managing and recovering our threatened plant species?
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, to follow on from Tony and Misha's comments, I think it's very appropriate to think about Botanic Gardens. I think the Botanic Gardens sector actually have some unique skills and facilities that can be accessed and applied to some of the challenges we're talking about. Now, obviously, Tony just outlined some of the challenges, but things like climate change obviously is major, and low recruitment rates in the field, in the wild, is also a factor which we are trying to investigate. In thinking about the climate change one, some projects that's going on at the moment, the Botanic Gardens and some of the universities together, is looking at the tropical Queensland mountaintop flora. Those as in Mount Bartlefree and Bellin and Kerr ranges. Obviously, these areas are threatened by climate changing, eliminating the habitat of these species that are basically cool tropical mountaintops more than 1,000 metres high. The aim of this project is really to secure in ex situ, like a conservation reserves, well-managed botanic gardens collections, both through seed storage, and I'll come back to that, and also vegetative propagation. So some of the species that are being looked at are obviously some of the orchids, the tree species like Eucryphia, and for those interested, the two native rhododendrons are also included in some of these studies that are being done. So the story, they're basically trying to store seed, and in many cases the species of those areas, these tropical cool areas, are not appropriate to be stored in our normal seed banking structure of drying and freezing. And so we've got to do quite a lot of research work, which is happening across to look at some of the germination requirements, trying to crack the germination cues basically for some of these species. And that means temperature gradient, looking at temperature gradients, humidity, light spectra, light regimes that they may be needing. So these are sort of some of the areas that we need to work on in terms of dormancy work and germination in terms of those projected future changes that are going to be, we're anticipating and the modelling is showing is going to change. I think in the vegetative propagation as well, there's quite a lot can be done. There's a fair bit of extreme horticulture going on in the skilled horticulturists in our botanic gardens. And that sort of, it might be seed production areas as well, and in the vegetative areas scaling up to be obviously going to translocations, which Misha and Tony are talking about in terms of managed species in the field. That gives us just a peep into genetics as well, because you can control much more of the genetic diversity you're looking at, making sure you're actually covering a good genetic diversity of the species concerned, the sampling and establishing that genetic diversity. Plus the record keeping and tracking lineages is another factor that we're pretty anal about, trying to keep the right systems going and the record keeping, which then would produce more information for the things like the threatened species index. So if you look at this amount of decline that Misha's revealed, this 70% for if there's no management, if we can bring it, slow that decline down by doing some things through botanic gardens and especially the translocations, that is a major factor. And mostly the botanic gardens partner with other agencies in terms of managing the translocations, and obviously there's many examples in Western Australia that have been done, and translocations are very successful. There's a bit of work that some of the species that are understory species common in the understory of the southeastern forest areas, things like Pomaderus, some of the work that we've undertaken recently in the gardens is showing that 11 out of 14 species, that's a genus in Rhamnaceae, most of you probably know, 11 out of 14 species required a temperature of 120 degrees C to break the dormancy. That's a blooming hot fire if you're going to have that sort of thing in the field. Obviously, it's not the same temperature, high temperatures for germination, but it just means that that is the sort of information we don't have for most species. More than 50% of our species we don't know the germination cues for in the plant species, not just threatened species. I mean the plant species as a whole. So maybe I'll leave it at that for now, Rachel, and follow up after.
Thanks so much, Judy. Really important points. So next up we have Jen Silcock, and Jen is a research fellow at the University of Queensland in the Queensland Department of Environment and Science. And there she has undertaken many years of research into threatened plant species. She's currently compiling a national action plan for Australia's threatened plant species. So Jen, from your work on the national action plan, can you tell us please, can you share with us some of the key threats that you see facing our most at-risk plant species? You're on mute, Jen.
Sorry, everyone. Totally betrayed my lack of technological prowess there. I'm much better when it comes to counting plants, mostly. No, so the threatened National Action Plan for Threatened Plants, we have highlighted the plight of 50 of our most imperiled species in there, which we identified through expert interviews and literature review, seeing which ones had these really sort of free-fall declines across all their populations. In terms of threats to those species, I think what Tony said really resonated. Habitat loss is the big one. Even if it's not ongoing, the legacy of past habitat loss has meant that a lot of our most endangered plants are confined to these very small remnants in a very fragmented landscape, and they're really vulnerable to ongoing loss and degradation. And also within small remnants, ecological processes often can't operate like they used to. For example, fire to break dormancy of species, as Judy was saying. The lack of recruitment of many long-lived trees and shrubs is sort of a sleeping issue. You probably wouldn't notice if you were passing by at the moment until all the living older plants die, and a lot of our most imperiled plants are just not recruiting at all. And even in less fragmented, more ostensibly intact landscapes, we still have some really big emerging threats. like Phytophthora and myrtle rust, which are driving plants on a pretty sharp extinction trajectory. So they'd be the major threats.
Thanks, Jen. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues later in the discussion. So next up, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Stewart. Steph is Principal Project Officer with responsibility for research liaison in the New South Wales Government's Saving Our Species program. As many of you know, Saving Our Species is a flagship program for managing and securing threatened biodiversity in Australia, based in the state of New South Wales. So Steph, could you please share with us a little bit about the work Saving Our Species is doing to help the threatened plants of New South Wales and how the index can support your work?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's great to be here today. One of the things that has been mentioned in the chat is that Saving Our Species actually has quite a large proportion of plants as part of its active project. So we use a cost-effective prioritization, at least in part, for our site managed species, and that's led to we have 77% of our active projects in 2020 were plant projects. So it is an area that we're really focusing on, and of course it's critical for supporting the different ecosystems across our state.
Great, thank you, Steph. And finally, I'd like to introduce, last but not least, I should say, I'd like to introduce Ashley Leedman. Ashley is the Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, Reporting and Improvement for the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, where he heads up a team helping develop a long-term monitoring program for Australian Government natural resource management investments. So Ashley, could you please tell us a little bit about your role and your involvement with the Threatened Species Index project and how the Threatened Species Index relates to the work that you lead?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, I've had a few roles in the department over the years, and I've come across the index in a couple of those important ways. Before I worked in the monitoring, evaluation, reporting, improvement section, I used to really work on threatened species listings, birds mostly, so I didn't have a lot of engagement in the plant sector, not being a botanist. But as part of that role, I was engaged, the department undertook a project to rework its corporate reporting. So this is public-facing corporate reporting. And what we were trying to do with the department was move away from activity-based reporting. It's long criticised that the department says, we did this, we spent this on, put up this much fencing, we did this many projects. What people wanted to hear was, what have we achieved in terms of our outcomes, our goals? And species and part environment is one of our goals. It's what we target investment in. So through that process, we really scratched our heads trying to come up with national measures that we could apply that would give us an indication of where we're at in relation to our threatened species and how we can track that over time. So this would have been a couple of years ago when the bird index came out. And that's really when we brought the threatened bird index into Australian government corporate reporting. So it's publicly available information. We'll be updating it yearly. And it's possibly, I don't know, the first in the world where we're actually using an index like this to report on how government and how the nation is going with these targets. So that was a really important part of target setting and incorporating the index into the work we did. More recently, I've moved into, as you mentioned, into trying to get better evaluation and monitoring for the Australian government's NRM investments. So primarily in some of the big projects or big programs in my area, the Regional Land Partnerships Program, a $450 million NRM investment throughout all Australia through the NRM regions. And more recently, we've been sinking a lot of activity and investment into bushfire recovery projects. And so into that space, one of my roles is to try and improve ways of reporting on how we can report against, again, outcomes, not outputs. So we don't want to report particularly on how much fence we put up or how much we've spent throwing out feral baits or how many cats we've killed. what we're really interested in is how are we going on those threatened species, both at that target, at that project level, but more broadly across the national level. And again, we've got a bunch of projects that are going to try and incorporate different ways. We're trying to improve monitoring standards and have centralized databasing and developing projects where we're bringing science into some of our NRM investments. But one of our big pushes is to incorporate our NRM investment, our NRM on-ground stakeholders. When we pay them to do a project, we want to collect their threatened species data. And really the only way we can do that is through the Threatened Species Index. So our aims are really to work with the TSX team into the future, to develop the tools, to get out the knowledge to all our NRM service providers on how to do it, and to start collecting that information. So it's not just for plants, but plants absolutely, because we're here talking about them. But it's also picking up on any of those threatened species. And over time, as Australian government's investments change, we will still pick up that and move forward. So if plants becomes a bigger focus, we'll pick up the plant stuff. And so we're really looking forward to developing those tools and working with the TSX team well into the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashley. So we're now going to move to an open Q&A, drawing on some of your questions and also some of the questions that have been fed to me by our team here. So I'm going to begin by asking about the representativeness of the Threatened Plant Index. How do we know, given that the index draws on non-published data, how do we know that the index, how do we ensure data integrity when it comes into the index? And more generally, what are some of your top tips for collecting robust long-term monitoring data for any kinds of threatened species, including threatened plants?
That one for me or for Hugh?
You can start, Misha.
Sure. Well, as I think Hugh mentioned in the chat, although we are drawing on data that is from non-published sources, it's not just any data on any monitoring anywhere. There's sort of a series of checks. I took this slide out actually because I didn't have enough time, but we have a whole fact sheet on the website that you can take a look at that talks about some of the minimum criteria that are needed in order for data to be suitable, not just for the index, but for time series in general. So one of the broader goals in the index, particularly going forward, is raising awareness of what some of those minimum standards are for data in order to be able to use them for time series. And these are things, mostly simple things, like I've mentioned in the talk, things like, you know, the site that you're monitoring needs to not change location or size over time. Your monitoring method needs to be either exactly the same or justifiably comparable over time. You need to collect data obviously in multiple years, but then there's further things like, is the seasonality of your monitoring appropriate to the species you're looking at? Obviously that's not always such a big issue for plants, but then with plants you have the whole issue of flowering and whether you're looking at different life stages and all these sorts of things. So we do have sort of minimum standards certainly for the index data, and those are still discussed over time. With plants it was quite interesting because there's, you know, questions around, do you include juveniles or seedlings in your data? Yes or no? That's a tricky question. I don't think there's the right or wrong answer, but you do have to be clear about the approach that you did take. Yeah, so that's a few thoughts for me.
Great, thanks, Misha. So we might move next to one of the questions that has been provided by our audience. There's been a recent study reanalyzing Living Planet Index data to show that the LPI trend is in some cases driven by only a few species. So how do we know that the Threatened Plant Index is representative of trends for most threatened plants in Australia? And how do we ensure the robustness of that independent of particular species driving those trends?
I'll have a go and then I'm going to flick to Misha. That paper is recently come out. We have looked at it a bit. It's quite still controversial, I think, in terms of what it shows. You would have seen the grey bars around Misha's plots, which basically, they're not quite 95% confident intervals, but that's not a bad interpretation of them, and that involves deleting time series. I think it's worth us exploring further deleting entire species and creating confidence intervals in that way, which is effectively what the Lyon paper did. And I think that's an analysis. I think the Living Planet Index is one way of analysing time series data. So again, our view is we want to make this data as publicly available as possible in the long run. We want to be able to also allow people to use other different forms of analysis method, because like any form of statistics, I'm a pluralist. There is no one right way or one wrong way to analyse the data. The Living Planet Index has a long, strong history of published data showing how strong it is, but I think we should try some other methods going forward.
Just a couple other quick thoughts on that one. I think one of the things that is quite different, I guess, between the Living Planet Index and the Threatened Species Index is that the Living Planet Index is looking at all vertebrates. So you would expect that some of those, perhaps many of those, are not necessarily declining. On the other hand, when we're looking already at only threatened species, it would be sort of surprising if over decades we weren't seeing decline. So I think that's something that's probably quite different between the data sets. That would mean I would be more surprised at whether looking at some of these different methods would radically change the trend that we have. But I certainly think it's going to be worth exploring the methods that they use. And as Hugh said, over time, applying different ways of analyzing time series to all of these data sets, absolutely. The one thing I will say is that one of the things we do quite a bit of is this sort of leverage analysis. So we do actually look at a lot of the different trends produced by the index, and we split that. So we look at, if you took out each individual species, so you take out this one species, what does the trend look like without that species? Take out species number 2, what does it look like without that species? So we get this graph that has a whole bunch of different trends that represent how it would look if you took out each species. And it's fairly rare that taking out one particular species has a huge effect on that. So that is one indicator that, you know, taking out groups of species might not have a huge effect. But that being said, we've always known that this method was sensitive to very strong upward or downward trends. That's not a big surprise. And I think looking at this data in as many different ways as possible, in a transparent way as possible, is going to be really good over time.
Yeah,
Great.
just say, oh, sorry, say
Yeah,
quickly, I had a chance to look at some of those leverage plots that Misha and the team have produced for this current iteration of the index. And you can see there is variation, but I think the fact that they've done really extensive leverage testing can give you a lot of confidence in the result you see here today for this taxa that are here.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now. We'll come back to talking about the index soon, but I wanted to open up the conversation around threatened plant conservation generally, and what some of the key issues are in conserving and recovering our threatened plant species. So would any of our plant experts in particular, or land management experts, like to comment on a question that's come in about some of the top things that land managers or policymakers can do to improve the well-being and trajectory of threatened plant populations in this country? What are some of the key things, particularly on the ground, that can be done to support our threatened plants?
I can have a go,
yeah, Tony.
just to start with. And I did mention, you know, clearing. I mean, it's still a major issue for plants. It has been for decades, and it continues to be. It's not necessarily something that's going to be done on the ground. It's really got to be something that's got to be done politically. But we need to make a change, because no matter what we do elsewhere, unless we deal with the clearing problem, the other problems aren't going to really solve the thing. So that's kind of a sad reality that I think we face at the moment. At the same time, I think there are a lot of other initiatives that can be done at kind of a high level across the country that haven't been done yet. I mentioned trying to get fire management guidelines done across the country. I mean, we have the knowledge to do it now. We just don't have the impetus to do it. Biosecurity is another particularly strong example. We had myrtle rust come into the country not long ago, and it's causing some pretty dramatic declines in plant species in the Myrtaceae. We don't want any more things like that to happen. Biosecurity is largely driven by agriculture, not the environment. So the environment is a fairly second cousin, poor second cousin, like plants are to animals in a sense, in that universe. And I think, so there's a whole lot of things that need to be done at a much higher levels to actually give us some more secure protection in the long term, especially as the climate changes and we get more of these problems coming to us.
Judy?
Can I add a bit of that? Agree with Tony, but I think also there are, as I mentioned, there are a large number of species that recruitment is really low in the wild, and we don't actually know sort of quite why. If you take a genus like Xeria in Rutaceae, where they produce very little viable seed, some seed, but very little viable seed. So a whole range of the species in the genus. You know, what is causing this? And that's one of the things that is being studied, and especially some of these species are ones that were, the whole total range of them was burnt in the last fires. So they are also, we need to be getting some idea of you know, their re-establishment in the wild. So there's that side of it. I also sort of agree with Tony in that I think it's some of it is about a focus and a recognition of the importance of these species, many of which are declining and most people aren't noticing. As I think Stephanie said, if you could walk past them and most people wouldn't notice that the decline is happening. And so we should be raising the profile if we can. It's the difference between the mammals and the birds and plants. And it was particularly obvious in all the news and things that happened after the fires. It was all about wildlife and you know, not too much about the dependency on a vegetation community and fodder for those species. So I think we've got a bit of a role to play in making sure that we raise this profile. And it's not easy to do. Some of us have been trying for a long time, but I think we need to look at some new practices. Obviously stopping the habitat loss and things is another more important, is also critical, but I think we have to take a different focus, and you know, actually talking about what we're doing in the department, I think is critical as well.
Yeah, look, I could jump in. One thing from our perspective. So as Sarah mentioned, we've got some pretty large landscape programs, RLPs across the whole of Australia. It's 450 million. We've just started the project, and perhaps one thing is missing is some of these landscape scale investigations into what works, what doesn't, what's best practice NRM. We, you know, surprisingly, after investing 25 years worth and however many dollars, we still don't have a great idea of what our best interventions are. We typically do replanting and weeding and feral animal control. We've got a bag of tricks that we pull out every time. But what we're trying to do now with RLP is do some bring some experimental approach in. And one of those projects is around working with CSIRO and Tern, looking at recovery in the bushfire affected space and our investments in what is the best way to undertake weed management, what are the impacts of different fire intensity, and trying to get a better understanding. So it's just one small thing that we're trying to do, I guess, to better understand some of the impacts of recovery from things like fires.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. So just a related question that's come in from Chris. Chris contends that that management actions often make more sense to people when they're couched in a broader landscape context or ecosystem context. And indeed that management actions around multiple threats make public justification narratives more accessible or relatable to people. So what are the chances of what is the relationship between managing at the ecosystem level and managing for some of our threatened plants? And a related question, I guess a follow-up question. I want to start with that question, but then a follow-up question. What is the likelihood of us developing a threatened ecological community index in future? But I might start with the first question on the relationship between that kind of broader management and the challenges or opportunities that represents for our threatened plants.
That's a really difficult question, so I'll try and answer it because I don't want anybody else to look as stupid as I'm about to look. I mean, I think in general, you know, broad scale, say fox baiting, rabbit control, herbivore management, policy changes, you know, which affect very large areas and broad scale investments, it is very hard to pick up the signature of those investments across multiple species. It's much easier to pick up an investment like we have done with if you put up a fence and you remove stock and do active management, you will hopefully get a reasonably good response in a few years. That said, you know, as the Save Our Species program in New South Wales has done, they've also invested in these broad-scale management options, and we often think that multi-species management is a sensible thing to do. You can't go and take every little population and manage it one by one. There's many broad-scale species, more so amongst the vertebrates, I suppose, but also amongst some plant that need to be managed at a holistic scale, broad-scale fire management, broad-scale herbivore management. So I think they're very important. You know, it's like so many things in landscape ecology. It's a large, massive, uncontrolled experiment. There isn't a good replication, and we're sitting in an environment with enormous year-to-year variability. To me, it to a certain extent just underlines the importance of long time series. You know, people committing to collecting data annually for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and you look at what the Northern Europeans have done, the Swedes, the Dutch, the British, you know, they have time series now of 40 or 50 years, and it's only after that period of time you're starting to get a twinkle of an understanding of what's going on. Depressing, but, you know, we're the generation to start that process.
I think, Jen, you looked like you wanted to speak before Hugh launched in. Do you have anything to
I'm
add?
very glad that Hugh pushed in. I think in terms of the landscape scale that the question was asking about, habitat loss is the big one that needs to be stopped. Otherwise, it just undoes gains that we might make in other areas, and that is totally a landscape scale process and a continent-wide process. It's obviously in a political sphere that we're talking about that, not sort of outside of what we're talking about with the threatened species index. But if indexes and long-term projects like this can just show what a dire state things are in, that may help get some leverage for these broader scale initiatives, like just stopping all habitat loss rather than keeping talking about thresholds. I know for some of our imperiled plants, the 50 most endangered ones we're featuring, at least 2 of them are about to have a big chunk of their habitat cleared. So, you know, that's pretty serious for those plants.
Yeah, so that's a really important point, Jen, and a few people have also sort of made similar comments in the questions and chat. But I think I want to draw that out a little bit more. What difference will something like a threatened plant index make? How can we, what is going to be or could be the relationship between putting indices like this into the public sphere and changes in policy and changes in investment that could actually help solve some of these problems? And what are some of the challenges in that, or potential points of disconnect between putting an index into the public sphere? How do we stop it just becoming a kind of another dire bad news story and actually help to integrate it in a way that can make a difference to decision making?
Yeah, well, I mean, I others know more about the index than me, but I do love how you can drill down into different regions and groups, and it's all there on the web app. You can look at whether you want to look at plants and then drill into whether they're managed or put different baselines up. There's a lot of nuance within the index because it's based on so many different species and they all have different stories and different life histories. There's a lot of nuance in there that you can really pull out, which, say, geographically, which areas are a lot of these declines been seen in, and conversely, which areas are plants doing okay in. And as the index grows and we get more time series and more taxa included, that those sort of questions can start to be answered more.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that, Jen, that something like the index, I think, is critical for engaging public interest. I think that people need to be able to see what's happening. I think Judy mentioned a lot of the press that came out after the bushfires. Although it was focused on fauna, you know, those kind of numbers really did catch people's attention and they got a lot of headlines. And to see this kind of decline clearly laid out in plants as well, I think is something that can really support those efforts. We know that a lot of publicity is not quite the right word, but a lot of action these days is driven by outrage. So I think, maybe it's not all about the good news stories. Maybe it is about just getting the bad news out there.
So I'll jump in there, I guess, because I do use it in a work situation. So it's you can't underestimate when we put up new policy proposals. Things like the index get written into those things. When we do our corporate reporting now, people can see it underpins our investment decisions at the highest level. So these sorts of indexes are quite important because we, the department still, we do evidence-based. It's part of what drives what we do and how decisions are made. And so that information does get up to the higher rungs and up to the minister. So she is aware when we want to do a new program that look what's happening to plants and we want to put in a plant segment in it. And this is one of the reasons. So you can't, the index is critically important in getting the message from us upwards.
Yeah, same with this methodology for New South Wales. These kind of, they want to know if our program's working, and being able to put multiple taxa together is a great methodology for that. I should maybe quickly say that the team on the index has also supported us to do our own analysis of just our taxa in our program and on our timescales, and that's been a huge boost to us in telling our story to the rest of our organization.
Great, thanks. And just following on from that, one of the things that is often asked about something like the index is how much it can inform how effective our investments are or management actions are, and on what scale. So we know that indices are produced nationally and also on a state scale. So for a program like regional land partnerships nationally, or for saving our species in New South Wales, perhaps those national or state-based indices can be a proxy. But how close are we to using something like the index to actually start to inform where management efforts need to go, or where investments are effective or could be improved?
That's a good question for Misha.
I was thinking so too.
I'm not sure if it is, because I don't have any money to invest. But look, I think, I think it's part of the story. I do think that there are some challenges. One of those being that often funding schemes tend to come in batches of 2 to 5 years, and a method like this that is a big aggregator is not necessarily going to tell you a statistically robust story over 2 years, right? So you just have to be a bit careful when thinking about time series, what it is you're asking, whether that method's appropriate to the question you're asking, and so on. So I think, some of these big signals that we see from the index, for example, that over a long period and over lots of different species, there's a strong signal that management does make a difference. So I think for telling these overall stories that, we do need to invest in threatened species management, and yes, it makes a difference, that it's really useful. I think on the smaller scales, you just have to be a bit careful and make sure that you're not expecting too much out of the right or wrong tool to sort of tell you a shorter term story if you are looking for, indications over a shorter time frame. I don't know if you has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's no substitute for a proper experimental design about interventions for a threatened species, and that's been going on in the NEST Threatened Species Hub as well, with focused work by Malleefowl is a good example. Sorry, I should have picked a plant, but where they're tracking a lot of populations and a lot of interventions and getting some return on investment calculations for things like fox management. So the threatened species index is not going to meet that gap, but for many of our species, the opportunities to do sort of before-after control impact design is very poor, because you can't get replication on an orchid where there's 17 in a cemetery in northwestern Victoria. You don't replicate an experiment with those 17 orchids. So that's why I think the broad index has its role above and beyond what detailed experiments do.
And just jumping on following on from that, for us, the index, we do 5-year Australian regional land partnerships is a 5-year program. We can think in, we don't know what the next one is, but potentially you can string them together and get 10 years. So you can start to make sense in that space. But the other part of it for us is if we can embed this sort of reporting into regional land partnerships, then what we're doing is we're embedding decent monitoring, following the rules of the index, which is over time, each year, same thing. So we can start to track species, we can start to lift more broadly how people monitor their species, how they record it. We can capture the data so we can find it again, because I suspect in Australia we've lost far more data, including Hugh's orchid surveys. We've lost so much data over time because we don't have structures to keep it in a national way. And I think the index will probably provide this, which will be a sort of an unplanned for gift, I guess, to the NRM community, which we're sort of hoping to piggyback on.
Steph?
Yeah, totally agree with that, Ashley. I think the way that this project can perhaps most support management is through bringing that issue of time series data and time series data capture to the forefront. There's so many things we can do with time series data to support management, to know if our outcomes are good, to know what's working and know what's not. And, the survey data and the shorter time scales just can't do that by themselves.
Could I also add something, Rachel? I think we also have to be careful about over-promising what we can do. Some of these plants we're talking about are very long-lived, so the actual time for their response to any management interventions is very slow, and it can take decades. So we have to be somewhat cautious about, shall we say, expecting the index to turn around too quickly. That's just the reality of how many plants function in the space. It's very good to have the ability to compare with managed versus non-managed, because that gives you a feel for what success you're having. But many threatened species are going to remain threatened for a long period of time, won't necessarily become non-threatened by the actions we take. Just be a bit wary of trying to overpromise as well, so the message isn't sold too much for that.
Judy, did you have something you'd like to add there? Okay, so one of the other issues that's come up is the responsiveness of our listing systems to new threats and to species that are newly under threat, or the lack of responsiveness. So what do we do in something like a threatened species index to account for the fact that some of our species are not yet listed but maybe newly threatened? What are some of the mechanisms built into the index for kind of capturing that group that's close to being threatened but is not currently listed on on a list of threatened species?
I'm happy to kick off on that one if you like. I think, as Tony showed in his presentation, the number of plants that are listed is a very small percentage of what is out there, and particularly in the current climatic context, the number of near threatened is growing all the time. I think it's a huge area to focus resourcing on. It's also the index itself, in terms of the methodology, uses not just EPBC listings, but it also does consider IUCN. So I think it has near threatened in it. That's a teeny little stopgap and an absolutely huge problem.
Yeah, the fact we've got the near threatened things in there, I think, is helpful. That said, of course, if anything gets listed, if there was data going back on that species, suddenly something gets listed as vulnerable. If somebody was counting it, possibly they were, because that's what caused the listing. They were counting it 5 years. All that data can just pile into the index. So the index will actually fluctuate through time as new data gets added in, regardless of once species are added in and out. There are some tricky issues around exactly what you do with things that are added in and out, but I don't want to go into that because we've spent too many hours arguing about it.
Yeah, great. So another question that's come up is, you know, where else is this being done in the world? Is anyone else doing a threatened plant index or a threatened species index anywhere in the world? And what would we expect to see elsewhere in the world compared to what we're seeing here in our threatened plant index in Australia?
Yeah, I think in addition to the Living Planet Index, which obviously is looking at this as a global metric, so trying to inform things like the targets in the Convention on Biological Diversity, so that's at the biggest possible scale. There are some other countries that do have headline indicators that use these types of methods. Off the top of my head, I probably won't get them right. I'm pretty sure that the UK is one. I'm quite confident that Canada is another one. So it's not unprecedented. There are countries that have incorporated this into their national level reporting to their citizens and within their environment departments. And then obviously we have that Living Planet Index, which is at a bigger scale. Again, I don't know, does anyone else have other examples?
I think that's about it. So is there any sense of how our threatened plants are faring compared to threatened plants globally? Tony or others, do you care to comment on that?
I'd say, I mean, there's no real difference in a sense. Interestingly, if you remember the slide I put up, most of the threatened plants around the world often have a narrow geographic range and are under threat, like the ones in Australia. In the difference probably is there's been a lot more extensive clearing in some of the other habitats around the world, not all. But if you're in parts of the Amazon in Brazil, you know, there's extensive clearing still going on now. If you're in North America, there's fire issues like we've had last year. Now in California, the same issues arising there. There's a whole lot of exotic species that are also causing problems in other parts of the world. Many of them are Australian species that have moved to some of those countries, particularly in South Africa. So I think there's a lot of similarities with what we're seeing here with what's going on in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think it's just really briefly, like land clearing has come up so much in this, it's clearly the biggest problem. Australia has a rate of land clearing that's more similar to a developing country than to most developed countries.
Thanks. Yeah. So in looking at the threatened species index or threatened plant index results from this year, for any of you, was there anything in the threatened plant index that surprised you? Anything that stood out as that you weren't expecting to see?
I mean, for me personally, and maybe the plant people will just laugh at me when I say this, but I think one of the reasons it is really important to do these aggregation exercises is that I was surprised that the plant decline overall was what it was, and also, you know, that it was worse in comparison with the birds and the mammals. That wasn't what I was expecting at all. Perhaps plant people would have been expecting that 100%, but I think it is, you know, just a general thing about the index is that I think it's very hard to predict what overall patterns are going to look like when you sort of just have a sense of what's going on in different places or different populations. I think it doesn't necessarily translate intuitively to the result that you get overall, and I think that that's one of the reasons it's so important to try and do it, because it's not always what you expect.
Jen?
Yeah, I completely agree with Misha. I was really surprised that the declines were greater in plants than the other taxonomic groups, the birds and the mammals. I think that's surprising because Australia doesn't have that awful record of plant extinction that is really well documented for mammals. I guess the areas I've worked in, a lot of inland Australia, things are going quite well with a lot of the plants I've worked on over the years. Some they're not, but a lot they are. So I was really surprised at the decline. I was also really surprised at that clear management response, and I think that's really encouraging. And yeah, I think the whole index has got a lot to look at, and hopefully will grow from here. I've been really surprised at how interesting the trends have been across Australia.
Judy?
Just to comment on I wasn't surprised about the decline. I don't think that the 70%. I was expecting it to be quite high, but I am encouraged by the fact that the managed population, managed species are looking at 60% decline, not as bad as the 70%, and also the translocations. You know, at 40%, that's giving us a much better hope for trying to get species back into the wild if we can. And one of the things I think came through in the Threatened Species Recovery Hub's translocation project, you were involved with that, Jen, weren't you? Or maybe it was Dave Coates and stuff. But anyway, bringing that together, it was very clear a lot of our translocations haven't been well monitored. And that's a thing I think we really have to improve on, in terms of if we're going to try and do getting species back into the wild through, you know, ex situ propagation and help of rewilding, whatever you might want to call it. I think we need to be really more strident about how we monitor and how we manage them post translocation. So I think we should be encouraged by some of those results and to look at how we actually do it. I'm not talking about making up new populations. I'm enhancing existing populations if they're there, so it's a bit more natural.
Yeah, absolutely, Judy. And I think the translocation monitoring needs to be really long term. The studies that have been long term have shown that early performance of translocations is often not a very good indicator of long term performance. Yeah. So all long term monitoring is good, but particularly when you're trying to create new populations or augment existing ones, a long-term monitoring approach is really fundamental.
And it seems to be much more successful if, you know, sometimes you're doing them in partnership with agencies that like it might be an electricity agency or someone that owns land that needs, but to actually have community groups or local community groups that are really interested in what's going on, it seems to be much more effective in terms of the long-term monitoring, because they care what's around them. So it's just small things that they actually will help us, I think, in some of this.
Yeah, great. And there are actually a couple of questions here about reintroduction programs. So I might just ask those quickly before we move to our last big question. The first is, to what extent were we able to include reintroduction work that's going on, for example, plantings by landcare groups in the index? Is that something that we were able to identify, or is the challenge of lack of monitoring data so pervasive that that was a real challenge? Nisha?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, any data that is collected in that standard way, in the same place, on the same species, in multiple years, can be included in the index. I think, I can't remember off the top of my head from my talk, maybe I'll think of it before I stop this question, but I think we had, what did we have? Only 43 odd time series across 11 taxa on those translocations. So there'd be many more translocation programs out there, and it's just a question of whether they've been engaged yet with the index, but also whether the monitoring does sort of adhere to that structure. I think, you know, in particular, having the exact same size can be problematic year to year. Sometimes the plots or the size of the monitoring area changes. That's not unique to translocations. In general, I think that's an issue with plants, because sometimes people might find a new population and sort of tack that onto the existing monitoring, but without in the data set having an easy way of telling apart so that you can actually exclude that new bit in the long-term time series. Yeah, so it's certainly possible, but obviously we don't have a huge number of monitoring data sets that include translocations yet.
Yep, so if you are involved in any of those projects on the ground, or you know people who are, you can go to the tsx.org.au website and find lots of tips on how to collect data that's appropriate for long-term trend assessment, as well as how to contribute to the index. So please head on over there. Judy, another quick one for you. Should ex situ management be automatic for all listed or all species that are listed as endangered or critically endangered? What are the selection criteria that determine seed banking decisions?
Seed banking, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good question. We try to, across the country, together with the Seed Bank Partnership, we try to cover a large number of the species, obviously, that are under threat or we know are not banked in any seed banking at the moment. A major part of that is obviously not just grabbing seed and putting in the bank. We really need to do germination experiments with them so we know how they're going to germinate. If there's not much point banking them if we can never grow them again. Well, that's not entirely true, but they could be used for other purposes, but basically it is. So the selection, the criteria, in terms, we work on some pretty strict criteria in terms of what species are collected and banked in terms of seed banking. But the other, and some of that is obviously critical, endangered, and what status they are. But it's also we can't cover those species I mentioned before that obviously what we call recalcitrants. That is, they're non-orthodox, and we know we can't store them in typical seed banking conditions. And that's taking more cryopreservation work, that sort of work to make sure we can. There's a fair bit of research happening in Australia on that, as well as overseas on banking those species. But I think one of the things to think about is much more, and I guess it happened with the birds as well, and Hugh can make more comment on this, but it's the near threatened, I think, that we're probably missing to some extent, and hence the concentration on those species that are much more widespread and we think are okay. But then when someone actually looks at them more carefully, there's decline happening in those as well. So trying to concentrate on that aspect is also important. I think that might answer the question.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Thanks, Judy. So I'm just going to ask one final question to any of our panelists. What is the future of the Threatened Species Index, and how can we ensure that it becomes institutionalized, both in a material sense, but also socialized and taken up, in a much broader social and community sense? So would anyone care to take on any aspect of that? Hugh?
We're running a chook raffle at the end of the night, so if you get a ticket as you walk out of the hall, it's a bargain. Yeah, so we are looking for resources. We have a lot of support from the federal government and the states, but we don't have enough money at the moment to continue the index as it is. So it is definitely actively on all our agendas. We desperately need the support of all the people who are listening to this call. Just verbal support, but also where they can. I think that if it doesn't get resources for a year or so, it's not a disaster, because all the data's there, it's well stored and organised, and it can be sort of exhumed anytime we like, this index, and run again. It would be unfortunate to miss a year, so we're working on that.
Great.
Maybe just following up on that, I think that's the resourcing issue aside, we do have quite a clear roadmap for some of the priorities that we have in the immediate term forward. So we've mentioned some of those today, but to briefly summarize, instilling a national data standard for time series, I think is very useful to this project as an outcome of this project, but also across many other initiatives. We have a nice wish list from some of our key stakeholders over the last few years about some new features that they would like to see in the index. And we'd also like to have some in-depth conversations with some of the large databases, because in some cases, some of these large databases, national scale research data repositories, etc., it can be quite difficult to translate outputs from these large databases into the index, whereas someone's individual monitoring project on one species is quite easy to get in there. So we've spent a lot of time mapping out what comes next, and we have a really good road plan. So I do think obviously it would be a huge shame if we didn't have resources in the immediate term, because I think it's clear that there's a lot of support and there's also a lot more work to do. It's not just a matter of churning out what we've done already. There's a few immediate priorities that would make the index a lot more useful straight away if we can get that resourcing.
Terrific. And how about in a policy sense? How is it already being socialised or institutionalised? Ashley?
Look, I can jump on there. Look, in a policy sense, as I said, we've got it tied into our corporate reporting. We are trying our best to embed it into Australian government NRM, regional land partnerships. The further it gets embedded, the more important it becomes to what we're doing, and then the more it can tell the story of how our investments are performing and how we can better use our resources to, for threatened species outcomes. So really, it's kind of early days, in a sense, because it's coming to an end of one phase of its life, but there's certainly a bunch of us in government who are very keen to embed it further in stuff we do.
Great. And I'll just turn to our plant advocates finally and say, how can we use the index to get broader community buy-in to support threatened plant conservation in Australia? Tony, Judy?
Yeah,
Tony?
I'll start. The index kind of tells a story. It tells a story of what's happening. And, you know, I would encourage those who have data or are thinking about collecting data, particularly after the large fire season we had last year, to actually look at collecting in a way that's compatible with the index. Because we need to be able to track how we're going. And this is our chance to do that in a transparent way, with data that's freely shared and freely available for people. I think that's a really wonderful thing. So, you know, we need to get that message out to people to say, we've got this measure of how well we're tracking, we can use it. And that's a way we should socialise that particular component of it.
Great. And Judy?
Just add to that, we've been, in Parks Australia, we've been trying to do status and trends for many species on our park and our Commonwealth parks for some length of time. We're actually working on a fairly good looking process at the moment that Nick McGregor's leading, but it's being able to use something like the index and for birds and mammals as well for that tracking and trying to get some assessment that we could report to government, whatever, about the status of our biodiversity. So I see that as something that we definitely need to be using. We've also been, as you be familiar with this, we've been running a science strategy action plan in the department, and really that Jeff Garrett's been leading, and it's we've embedded and talked about things like the index in part of that. So it's early days and there's high level stuff already, but I think embedding that underpinning science and the data we need is quite attractive to a lot of people. So because they need that information, as she says, whether it's for policy or whatever it's for, we need to be able to have it. And I think we can build on the interest and get it start getting embedded in some of those areas.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating in our panel and discussion. And thank you to our audience for hanging in a few minutes over time just then. It's been a great pleasure to hear from all of you, and also to have all of you in our audience contribute questions and comments throughout this webinar. We really appreciate it. So we'll be following up soon with a recording of the webinar and also with a resources pack that has more information on where to find information on threatened plants, information on the index and how to contribute, and many other things. So please keep your eye out for that. We also have many other webinars that we've undertaken this year. So please look on our NESP Threatened Species website for under the events tab for recordings of our all three of our webinar series that we've held this year and information about future webinars to come. But I just want to finish by saying congratulations to the Index team and to our hundreds of partners around the country who've contributed data, contributed support and infrastructure to help make the Index a reality. And thank you and congratulations to all of the threatened plant specialists out there who are working hard to monitor and assess how our threatened plants are doing and to recover our threatened plants. So thank you for joining us, and we'll say goodbye.